Hey guys, I'm super excited to be introducing this panel on staking centralization. I'll first do a round of intros, let all the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll go right into the discussion. So yeah, my name's Walter. I'm a data science lead at Gauntlet. Gauntlet's a crypto economic research firm specializing in quantitative modeling and optimization at the forefront of DeFi.
Hey everybody, I'm Izzy. I contribute to Lido DAO as Master of Validators. If you're wondering what that is, basically myself and the co-contributors that work with me act as an interface in between node operators that utilize the Lido protocol and the Lido protocol and the DAO itself, and also help shape like the strategy of the future of validation through Lido.
Hello everyone, I'm Matthias. So I'm one of the core team member with SSV Labs. So SSV Labs is actually the main developer behind SSV Network, the very first implementations of distributed validated technology, or DVT, as a network. So just a quick one about DVT, if anyone here is not sure what it is. So you basically allow a group of operators itself collaboratively manage a validators, right? Validators key with different configurations in terms of different clients, data centers, and all this. Yep, thanks.
Yeah, I'm Yannick. I lead ventures at Chorus One. We're one of the largest institutional node operators. We currently support, I think, around 60 networks, and also have an internal research and ventures team. So I lead the ventures side, and then we have a research team, which is the actual smart people, digging into MEV, pre-confirmations, also stuff like DVT, generally like any new technologies that relate to staking. Yeah, happy to be here.
Cool, okay, so the topic of the panel is on staking centralization, its risks, and its solutions. What do you guys think, why is this an important problem to consider for all the, everyone in crypto talks about decentralization as sort of an ethos, but with regards to staking, why is decentralization actually a risk? Why do we actually have to talk about it?
Well, there's no point in having a slow database if it's centralized, right? So, you think about blockchain trilemma, the thing that underpins the integrity, right, of what we're trying to build, which is the future of a financial settlement layer for the entire world, requires something like decentralization, because it essentially disintermediates the ability for any one sovereign, whether that's a nation state or a set of collective powers, to control the history of the veracity of financial transactions. So decentralization can mean a lot of things, but essentially it is the thing that enables the unique properties of blockchains that a lot of traditional centralized systems don't have, which is censorship resistance, which is important not only in the sense of censorship resistance of transactions as speech, for example, the ability for people to transact in countries that maybe are not able to interact with the rest of the world, but also in terms of financial guarantees, which is what Max was talking about earlier today.
I think, you want to take it or should we? Okay. So I think decentralization is good in the sense of one of the things Izzy just mentioned itself is censorship resistant. I think blockchain, to me, work the best in terms of a decentralization way. But if you talk about Ethereum staking itself, it also relates to default tolerance and also the resiliency of a validator node. But don't get me wrong. So for me itself, I know a lot of people talk about stake centralizations, people having a lot of stake in their protocols and all this itself. But to me, in my own opinion, I feel that stake centralization is in terms of how each and individual operators run their nodes. It's not really about these protocols have so much and all this, but it's more towards the sense as I know I'm probably shilling a bit maybe, but I think the way node operators are run right now is very, very important to run it in a distributed and decentralized manner, because even Microsoft can have big issues a couple of months ago. That also means that even we talk about clients or even data centers and all this stuff, maybe one day they will fail. Then I think that is primarily the part that if you have a lot of TVLs or ETH in your protocol, you need to run it in a decentralized manner. You can't run it like a single operator manner itself, where some of the operator might be using same clients for the backup. So if really any mishap happens in terms of client or data center, then the whole Ethereum itself is going to suffer. So running in a decentralized and distributed manner itself is much, much more better, and also at the very same time saving the whole Ethereum ecosystems. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think kind of censorship resistance and resilience is probably the two most important for me. I assume we'll talk mostly about Ethereum today, but I think generally you also see a progression, right? Networks often start off somewhat more centralized, right? You first, there's usually not that much TVL or economic activity in general early on, and as kind of blockchains go through kind of maturity, you see more more different clients. You see more resilience and decentralization kind of throughout the stack, not just kind of in terms of where nodes are based, but also the client software they run. And kind of have different kind of elements to this. But yeah, I agree. I think for me it's also the kind of censorship resistance. Once there is a lot of economic activity, you want to have the assurance that not one single entity can do something that they shouldn't, and no one can stop them.
Cool. Let's go a little deeper then into all this. Obviously, in the staking landscape these days, there's a lot of trends that drive user behavior. There's a lot of trends that drive operator and validator behavior as well. What do you guys think is the sort of natural equilibrium that we can arrive at in terms of staker behavior, validator behavior, and what does that really look like right now? Start with Yannick.
Hello. That works. That's a good question. I think it really depends on the blockchain, right? But I think the best thing in terms of equilibrium you can do is kind of make it as easy as possible for anyone to stake, right? Which is also, talking about Lido, the reason why I think early on you guys saw a lot of success was because it was a way for a lot of people to stake. And we see this trend generally happening where validators, or running nodes generally becomes more and more complex. We're more and more involved as validators, be it on the economic side, but also just kind of in terms of like the infrastructure that we need to run. And yeah, as the chains mature, it gets even worse or even more complex, depending on how you look at it. I think like a natural equilibrium for me is somewhere in the middle where you do have enough tooling to allow anyone to kind of, to have, I would say, like sufficient decentralization in terms of like node operators. So you have enough individuals as well that can run nodes. You have with that enough geographical distribution, but then also have, kind of enough institutionally great kind of infrastructure running so that it actually, is performant, that it actually kind of can carry, large amounts of economic activity. And so kind of finding the balance there, I think is kind of the key for us, but it's also something that's just, it's a bit hard, right? I think we're still, even with Ethereum, we're still like struggling to see where exactly we can be and what's kind of the optimum there.
If I can add to that, so I think you hit the nail on the head that first of all, it depends on the network itself, like what are kind of like the starting parameters of the network. And then according to like either the direct properties or the meta properties of the network, how easy is it for anybody to potentially run a node? So for some really high throughput networks that have like very high hardware and bandwidth requirements, it's the barriers to entry are very, very high, which means that basically there's like a default selection criteria here that biases towards large infrastructure operations to be the bulwark of the validator set. Other networks, and a lot of times like very, very purposefully and deliberately, like Ethereum, try to target smaller, almost like retail consumer segments to be the backbone of like the validator set. However, that kind of like doesn't necessarily take into account market dynamics, which is what I think we saw in Ethereum, right? So you might want to target that like anybody can run a node at home, but then you have to consider to what extent are they able to, like do they have the funds necessary to be able to get the hardware, a good enough internet connection? But then the third and most important thing is like the capital requirement to actually run a node operator. And so like Yannick mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that liquid staking protocols have seen, and in general also centralized staking solutions, have seen such preference, I guess, in the market is because they allowed people to participate, even if it is like one step removed, with the validation process with a much smaller amount than the initial required capital of 32 ETH, but also do so in a way that still makes like their voice a part of the network. And I think that's essentially what makes Ethereum's kind of like weird flavored version of delegated POS, like a little bit more interesting than necessarily the direct versions of delegated POS, because the staking protocol that you choose to stake through kind of entails a set of preferences and like user ethos requirements, if you want to think about it that way. So protocols like Lido that started off with the idea of create a protocol to fend off the possible mass centralization of stake and centralized exchanges by creating a competitive product on-chain to do something very, very similar, did quite well in getting like a large market share, but they've hit an almost socially consensus-driven glass ceiling, if you want to think about it that way, that basically says, if you don't continue to deliver on the mission to decentralize the protocol and then therefore the underlying network, you're not going to go much further than here. And so that's like a very, very interesting aspect of how Ethereum works specifically, and that's why you start seeing a lot of liquid staking protocols also like converging on design. So regardless of whether you started with a maximally decentralized approach like Rocket Pool did, or a more mass scaling approach like Lido did, you're starting to see all of these protocols do a little bit of both. So in Lido now you can also participate in the set as a node operator through something like Simple DVT, which uses SSV and OBOL and allows community stakers, even home stakers, to co-run nodes together with large professional node operators like A41 or Chorus 1. And then there's a new module coming out which is called the community staking module, which basically is permissionless node entry. So anybody will be able to run a validator using Lido. And I think as you see this convergence of kind of like solutions, regardless of the starting point of the different protocols, you're also seeing where this natural equilibrium is going to start to be built.
Yeah, one note just to that, sorry. I think the one thing that we do sometimes forget though is, I totally agree, right, it needs to be easy and everything, but then it also needs to be, kind of economically incentivized enough, right? Like, I mean, we've seen that, Ethereum APR has gone down a little bit, right? There's maybe, I mean, we all know that most people in crypto that, yield funds around do it for like the maximum amount of value they can generate. And so I think that's one thing that I think protocols on both ends, kind of on the very mature side, but also on the very early stage have been struggling with, right? It's like early on, maybe you spend too much money on security, right? The inflation is too high. There's, a lot of rewards that, go to a very small amount of people. And then later on, kind of as the network matures, right, there's less staking rewards. And so if I'm a holder of Ethereum, for example, right, like what makes me run a node? I mean, people generally don't care that much about decentralization, right? We always want them to, but in the end, right, like, I mean, people still use Facebook and so on, even after everything that happened over the last 10 years. And so I think that's like one thing as well, where we're like finding the equilibrium, what like, long term with like the right amount of rewards that, incentivize staking also on a more individual level. It's really hard to do, but I think that's also one thing that often gets overlooked.
Okay, you just answer what I want to answer. But anyway, I mean, since touching on Yannick's point itself, I think I want to disagree in one thing, is that right now we still have not seen Petra update. So at this moment of time, I just feel that, yeah, I mean, I agree in a sense that like the economics of skills itself, people don't really want to see and run it, and people don't really care about the centralizations or how individuals run the nodes and all this. But I think when Petra happens itself, where all the nodes can be colluded into one, and the value of one node itself is much more higher, then people will then start to feel the pain. Because right now 32E, if you miss a few attestations and all this stuff, no one really cares about it. But when Petra happens, when all the nodes are colluded into one, when the attestations values and block proposal or penalty value itself is multiplied according to the number of nodes, then I think people will really start looking in terms of like, okay, so right now the value is higher, the penalty is higher, so how am I supposed to actually make sure that I don't lose so much money in the validated nodes itself? So I think at this moment of time, every individual node operators, like, you guys, A41, they have very robust infrastructure, scalability is there, definitely a very good choice. But when Petra update comes, things will become a little bit more complex. So I think institutions or even validators themselves will start to actually think of like ways and solutions, how to really make the offline or clients' issues to actually prevent this mishap from happen to lose the value of the validated nodes after Petra. Yeah.
Cool, that makes sense. So Izzy talked a bit about the sort of technologies and innovations that, that we can drive towards a good equilibrium staking. Matthias talked a little bit about the mechanism design, and Yannick talked a bit about the economics behind it. My question then is, how do we balance all these things against the need for scalability then, right? At times it seems like centralization and scalability can come into head against one another. How can we use the technologies that we just talked about to sort of drive the scalability issue and make blockchains more easy to use? Matthias, why don't you start? I'm giving everyone a chance to start. So you're up right now.
I always believe, not because I'm working with SSV, but I just feel that DVT staking is really going to be like the gold standard of staking next. Doesn't matter you use SSV or OBO, to be very honest. Indeed, everyone is going to use everyone at the end of the day. Why would I feel so itself is that, you talk about scalability and centralizations itself, right? I mean, centralizations, to me, I'm a little bit pro decentralizations, to be very honest. So I run my own validators as well. I mean, even for right now itself, I want to run it in a distributed manner. I want to make sure that every single thing itself can be avoided. Izzy and Yannick know that I travel quite a lot, so I don't have sufficient time to really take care of my nodes, to be very honest. So, especially after Petra and all this itself, I'm talking about centralization side of things. So when I run in a distributed manner and all this itself, I can make sure that validators don't go offline. In scalability itself, if more and more validators are going to run in terms of a DVT manner itself, Ethereum can scale even better. Scale better in terms of we don't want things like Microsoft things to happen, or even we talk about 2-3 clients failing at the same time itself that cause the whole Ethereum chain to actually halt. So scalability, centralizations, I don't know. I feel that the gold standard right now is DVT staking. Yeah.
I think that's fair. I think the one thing that introduces a possible tension here, and it's something that we talked about, like Yannick brought up earlier, is the economic viability. So while DVT is really, really great from a technical and operational resilience perspective, and also great as an effective reduction in barriers to entry for somebody that might want to run a validator but doesn't have enough starting capital, or is scared about running a validator completely on their own, because the first time you set up a validator, your hands are sweating even if it's on testnet. So the fact that you can run it with 3 of your friends, and if you're offline because you're BDing in South Korea and you're at a K barbecue and you're too drunk to fix your validator, it's pretty great. But the problem is that you're also now splitting those revenues with another 3 people, right? And the more people that you start onboarding onto the network via this kind of disseminated validator co-running infrastructure, the more people you're splitting a smaller, not a smaller total pie, but the pieces get smaller as the size of the pie proportionally starts decreasing in the rate at which it's increasing. And so then you also have to contend with the fact of the possible issuance reductions, right, that are being discussed. And yes, Petra is going to come out and it's going to allow for the consolidation of validators, but realistically speaking, only really well-funded operations, really large node operators or operators that are using capital provided by professional organizations, are going to be able to consolidate validators. So solos will not be able to consolidate validators. DVT apportioned, validator clusters may be able to run larger consolidated validators because at least the threat of slashing is greatly diminished. But as a solo, you won't. And then you think of the rate of compounding that is offered by consolidated validators isn't even that great. So to what extent are node operators actually going to be incentivized to create this scalability? The whole point of consolidation in Petra is that there's fewer validators on the network, so there's less bandwidth taken up, and peer-to-peer network latency and congestion goes down, and so we can work on things like single slot finality. And at the same time, it's there's something being proposed, but the incentives for it are not great enough to offset the potential negative economic repercussions there. So from a systems design perspective, I think what we're continuing to see in Ethereum is like a little bit of a chasm in between the idea of how we can improve the network from like a usability and scalability and usage and utility perspective, and how it actually ends up playing out like once market forces kind of like help find where this equilibrium is.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head from my point of view. I do think it's an issue that, you know, this doesn't usually get considered as much, right? Like, I mean, of course we want people to be, you know, kind of selfless and, you know, believe in decentralization and do it because of ideologies and ethos, but realistically that never really happens. I mean, we see people, you know, yeet money into smart contracts or some, you know, multi-sigs for some expected yield at some point, right? I mean, that's kind of the bar there.
Or for points.
Or for points, yeah. So I do agree. I think it's hard to kind of, you know, balance the two. I do think, you know, less validators definitely makes sense. I mean, talking about like sufficiently decentralized, right? Do you really need 1 million? Probably not. You know, maybe 100,000 are enough across the globe if they're, you know, geographically decentralized, and that helps a little bit with scalability. Maybe we do need an L2 roadmap to, you know, scale without needing to, you know, further centralize the stake or optimize, you know, like crazy on the base layer. I think there's different routes here, but yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of like the trade-offs there.
Since we're talking about points and tokens, it makes sense to sort of transition the conversation.
Walter saw his opening.
Towards restaking, right? Yeah, at a high level, for people that are not too familiar with what restaking is, it's basically taking the sort of ETH that's securing the L1 and using it and repurposing it to secure secondary services on top. These secondary services can be like, are often like for scaling Ethereum, they can be like oracles, DA layers, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, my question is then, do some of the dynamics that we've talked about here, like the concerns with centralization, how does this like evolve with restaking? Are some of these aspects like amplified? How do they change? What do you guys think?
So I think there's definitely a lot of like mirrored challenges, tensions, and characteristics here, especially with the earlier discussion that we had around like how do networks use validator sets? What are they good for? Like what makes for good economic security, and where are the possible equilibria based on how the different systems are designed? So I was in an interesting chat the other day. I mean, it wasn't the other day, it was like 9 months ago. And somebody was like, Izzy, you know, should we create an app on an L2 or should we create an AVS? And I said, like, the only question you need to ask yourself is, are you raising or not? So yeah,
that's a good point.
So like economic security, first of all, do you need it for your app, right? Second of all, how much of it do you need? Or are you going to end up creating demand for more economic security than you can pay for? And then how are you going to pay for it? So if you're going to end up in paying for it in the token that you're essentially like restaking, like Ethereum, it's going to be super, super expensive. If Ethereum is not actually spent on your app or on your chain in order to create a viable and sustainable feedback loop, you're going to need to pay for it in some other way, which is probably going to be either your token, and if investors basically hear that like you're going to be spending tons of your tokens to pay for the security that you're renting from Ethereum, that's like a really, really difficult thing to convince that you have like a sustainable economic model there. I think a few AVSs can definitely do this, but I don't know if there's going to be tens or even hundreds that will be able to do that from a viability perspective. And then you also have to think about, okay, so if you're not going to use your own secondary token, you might be using a secondary token available on the market, like the token of one of the AVS platforms, right? Like Eigen, for example. And there you start to get into really interesting questions and considerations around to what extent is the AVS platform itself symbiotic to the base layer or parasitic. And Max had a really interesting point earlier today where he said that to a certain extent, tokens of L2s like OP may be parasitic to ETH as opposed to purely augmentative or complementary. And the reason for that is because these tokens may reduce the actual moneyness of the base currency. So for example, if you say that I could be using like restaked ETH to provide security for everything, or I could just be using ETH to transact on those networks versus something like Eigen that will control their economic security, to what extent is it useful for ETH as a base platform to have a secondary platform on top that removes this additional utility from ETH and sends it to another platform? So it's a very interesting trade-off from a systems design perspective around to what extent does a network that is definitely like useful and augmentative when it starts out and complementary eventually substitutive, and where is the equilibrium between those two things?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think the main point for me with restaking is, as you said, like, are you raising, right? Like, how much of that security do you really need? Like, Chorus One's been, I think, the largest validator in Cosmos for a while, and we've kind of gone through this both with app chains, but also interchain security already to some degree. And the economics are just really hard, right? Like, I think everything in crypto follows somewhat of a power law distribution, and kind of we've seen this with app chains. There's few that can afford the economic security, that have enough, be it hype or actually kind of revenue, that that it works out for them economically. Yeah, I think a lot of them AVSs don't actually need the security. As a mechanic, kind of it inherently makes sense to me, right? Like, if I want to start a project, I don't necessarily want to set up a whole validator set, right, or build a full L2 or something along those lines. But yeah, I think we're still kind of very early on there, and kind of it'll go the natural like hype cycle progression of kind of after the launch we'll see like, well, this doesn't really work well for most projects, and then we'll see slow transition to projects for who it does work, and then yeah, the question whether it is good for Ethereum or not. I think it really depends on how it's designed ultimately, and how much value gets kind of put into these systems, like how much stake in the end. Like we saw EigenLayer receive like a huge amount of TVL very quickly based on points. Like there wasn't really anything you could do with it. But yeah, I think once the system is actually live, which is I think generally an issue in crypto, right? Like we always tend to value things that are pre-mainnet, pre-actually anything, kind of more so than once they're actually live. That we'll see kind of which direction this will go.
You guys, what do you mean to answer? You guys already answer everything. Right, but by the way, I think I spoke to quite a couple of AVSs recently, actually, and I asked them about like the slashing mechanism about EigenLayer, how much security they need, which you cover as well. So apparently, a lot of them tell me that we don't know. That's the answer from them to me. We don't know how much security we need, and in fact, do they really need that? They can't give me an answer as well. Yeah. So I think previously when there's hype of like restaking and EigenLayers and before the airdrops and all this, a lot of people I speak to itself, when I ask them what's restaking, they would have to tell me that it's a gamble in a degen manner, points, airdrops, and all this. All right. So, but over at SSV side of things itself, I mean, at this moment of time, restaking protocols is just a few of them. It's quite centralized in a manner. So if I'm going to come into as a SSV perspective itself is to actually help them to run it in a decentralized manner, just to make sure that we are safe in terms of the Ethereum base layer side of things. Yeah.
I think one additional point I want to add is that we talked about the role of the validator in kind of the network itself, and as it is getting more complex, right, it definitely also makes it increasingly harder for individuals to run, right? Now you all of a sudden have to think about, okay, which AVSs you need to or want to support, right? Like, so on our end, we've been going through kind of a tech due diligence process with every single AVS, where our engineers look at the code and kind of see, does it kind of meet at least, kind of a certain threshold before we would support it. And so I think in that sense, these systems potentially pose a threat to kind of, the decentralization of Ethereum, because as it gets more and more complex, as you need to be more and more active as well, like you couldn't even do it as an individual. Maybe something like Lido or SSV can help in terms of like, I think that's also why we saw LRT products get a lot of traction, because they can help with this pre-selection, they can make it easier again, right? Similar with Lido. So I think that's also one dimension to this where, yeah, it's just getting increasingly complex. We really haven't been paid yet either, so that's an issue. But I think on the other hand, it's just, yeah, we saw so many AVSs, probably a lot of them don't really need the security, but you still need to run more and more and more infrastructure if you want to support, restaking on top of normal staking, and I think that definitely kind of, prices out more and more people as well.
Yeah, there's definitely like a convexity when it comes to the complexity in running these services, right? If you're running, there are like what, 20 AVSs right now? 23? I don't know what that exact number is. There's more?
I think it's much more.
There's more? Okay, fine, whatever. But like, yeah, you can imagine like there's overlaps in this stuff, and when you say run like 20 different AVSs, it's going to be like quite difficult, or like the software is going to be like increasingly complex, right? And they can be quite different. So obviously, like, seems like one aspect of centralization is you have like you just talked about, right? The operators get increasingly sophisticated, they get more advanced, and as a result, like you just see sort of the accumulation and aggregation at this level. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. My last question, I guess, before I open it up to the audience then, is do you guys have any hot takes? I know we actually had quite a bit of hot takes already here on like restaking in general, but like, do you guys have any other ones that you think are not restaking related, let's say?
I think one that may not be that hot anymore is that kind of centralization is probably good depending on how it looks, right? I think like, Lido got a lot of hate for a while there. Like, oh, it's 30% or something, right? But then you guys are actually doing a lot of good in terms of like making sure the operators run professionally, making sure that kind of client diversity is there, like all these different risk factors are addressed. Plus now innovating and pushing more and more people towards DVT, be it OBOL or SSV. Now you mentioned the community module that is coming. So through that, kind of finding a very kind of naturalized progression in terms of like, decentralizing the protocol while having still, the centralization in there and making sure that, not Binance runs everything. So I think like in that sense, I think centralization for a lot of chains makes sense, even if we look outside of Ethereum, right? Like how many chains really need, hundreds of validators? It's probably a question that, in my view, probably a lot of them don't. Like you can be sufficiently decentralized probably with 50 or so on a Cosmos chain, depending on how they're set up, obviously, but then also with a lot of these chains early on, you do have a large centralization in terms of kind of the funds that are, the token distribution. But yeah, I think that would be probably my hot take. Like centralization is good, depending on kind of, where it is centralized.
I think that makes sense, and to a certain extent, that is one of the arguments for like fatter protocols that have this ability to make like meet space interactions, I guess is what we call it, that the base layer cannot. So one of the problems with trying to decentralize a validator set through code at the Ethereum-based network layer is that there's things that the code cannot discern, right? It does not know where a node operator is running their node. It does not know what software they're running, even though there's like ideas about how to do that. Basically, you can cheat all of them unless you're running the entire validator in a TEE, and TEEs are Swiss cheese. And actually, maybe that's my hot take, because there's like a lot of...
I agree.
Like, I think TEEs are not so great. They're useful for like, if you need secrecy for a very, very short amount of time, that then is not like useful later on, so it's okay for something like Suave. If you're basing like the entire secrecy or privacy of your chain on a TEE, your chain is gonna have a lot of problems.
My hot take. Global ETF is going to get a lot of volume the next 3 to 5 years.
What ETF?
Global ETF.
Global ETF.
Global, yeah. Ethereum ETF. I still want to believe that stake ETF is going to be approved soon, now or later, hopefully soon. And there's going to be a lot of volume.
In the States or here in Singapore? Do you know something we don't?
I don't know, I can't say. Yeah. So honestly, right now we are already starting to kind of speak to like different ETF issuers right now. It's like back to day one, educating them about Ethereum staking, just to plant the seed right now. And also, I mean, that's what I believe in. Basically, I believe that stake itself is going to be approved soon. So we are going to market. Volume is coming definitely from there as well. And we're starting to educate them about, like, to them, institutions, two things that matter. There are three things that matter: security, risk, and use, basically. So they might be able to only stake like 60% and 40% at the liquidity, but we just want to make sure that we are there educating about different ways of like staking their ETH, be whether through Lido, be whether through professional operator like A41 and Chorus 1, but of course not without SSV. Yeah. So we are educating them about in terms of like how DVTs can actually bring this security and risk factor down. Yeah, I think my hot take itself is still global ETF.
For a staked ETF, would you, like, in the create redeem process, would you, like, create and redeem with LSTs or with the actual, like, staked ETH? Just curious, actually, how this works.
I'm not sure in terms of, like, you know, whether it's going to be LST or not, but ultimately itself is up to that individual issuer. It might be able, I don't know, I mean, depend on jurisdictions and be it whether it's US or be it whether it's in Canada, ETP and all this itself. Maybe the regulator, or even in Hong Kong, maybe the, I don't know, maybe the regulator might approve like you can stake your ETH into your own personal vault, you know, or institution vault. Like, I'm not sure whether I can say it. Lido institution vault.
I mean, I think the main issue for like staked ETFs is liquidity, right? Like they will need to be able to do redemptions quite quickly, and can't really rely on purely the Ethereum like staking queue or unstaking queue. But then if you talk about using something like Lido or other LSTs, you have the additional smart contract risk on top of it, right? So that's probably also then more difficult again for a lot of the issuers. So I think it still remains to be seen like how that looks. We as operators obviously hope it'll be some sort of native ETH staking involved, and there'll be a basket of operators, right? Like the A41 or Chorus One together. But I think generally on the liquidity side, like staked ETH or something would also make sense. So maybe there's like I mean, I know that some people are working on like different ways to going about this, but maybe it could also be a mix of like natively staked ETH, LSTs, and then ETH just held at custodians.
I actually come across one particular provider itself doing a validator marketplace right now. Not sure whether you guys heard of it. So they work with like market makers and a couple of market makers to enable the liquidity portion side of things for these ETF. It's like, they can trade freely in terms of the validators. Not sure how the backend mechanism really works, haven't really deeply researched into it, but it allows like, institutions to buy validator and exit a validator as and when they want, where the market maker can actually place a bid to actually process the transactions. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't really have time to talk about how the regulation side affects all this. Probably that's a conversation for a different time. But yeah, this wraps up the panel. If the audience has any questions, feel free to ask all the panelists. You can ask them for more hot takes if you want. Cool. Okay. Yeah, it was great moderating the panel. Great discussion, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.